Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Bow, 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 bow.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Abarigani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this Saturday, April 25th, 2026. We commence today's program with our African drumbeat historical calendar. Our central theme for today's program is the afterlives of slavery, the unfinished war against Black life. This hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Amanda Laury Kleintop, assistant professor of history at Elon University in North Carolina and author of the book Counting the Cost of Freedom, The Fight Over Compensated Emancipation After the Civil War. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Keith Finley, associate professor of history at Southeastern Louisiana and author of the book From Slavery to Segregation, Reckoning with White Supremacy in the American South. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Grover Washington Jr., Herbie Hancock, Eddie Harris, Jonathan Blake, Alice Coltrane, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
It's a slap in the face when everyday crimes are videotaped and shown to us repeatedly.
This is Michael Mixon Moore, the militant mixmaster.
And Hiran Kamati Raskasa with our special broadcast. A state of emergency, guerrilla radio, broadcasting live and direct from the streets in the midst of the rebellion.
Over 20 cities in the United States have
York
gone
City,
up in rebellion.
Seattle, Los Angeles,
San Diego,
Las Vegas,
Boulder, Colorado,
Omaha,
Beloit, Wisconsin,
Madison, Wisconsin,
St. Louis,
Warrensburg, Ohio,
Birmingham, Alabama,
Tampa, Florida,
Atlanta,
Pittsburgh, PA,
Gary,
Boston,
Philadelphia,
Oklahoma,
Washington, D.C.
So we present the State of Emergency Project, a spoken word broadcast.
National rebellion by Africans and indigenous peoples.
Stay true to the people.
Molweni Ekai. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. We bring you this calendar in memory of our revolutionary ancestors. April 25th, 1878. 206 African ex-slaves born in the United States resettle in Liberia, fulfilling the dream of every slave to return to their homeland. April 27, 1964. Tanganyika and Zanzibar merged under the banner of Pan-Africanism to become the new East African national nation of Tanzania. April 27, 1972. Kwame Nkrumah, chief architect of Pan-Africanism, dies. Kwame Nkrumah led the Gold Coast renamed Ghana to independence from British colonialism, and at the Independence Day celebration made the statement that Ghana's liberation means nothing as long as any black person in the world remains oppressed, and that Ghana would provide all of its resources for the liberation of Africa from colonialism. April 27, 1803. Toussaint Louverture, African leader of Haiti's independence, dies in a Paris prison. April 28, 1910 to 1984. He Zizhen was a soldier and a member of the Chinese Communist Party in her teens and Mao Zedong's second wife. She was one of the 30 women who made the historic Long March in 1934. She was pregnant at the time and later wounded by shrapnel as she protected a comrade from an aerial bombing. She remained a committed revolutionary all of her life. April 28, 1967. Muhammad Ali stripped of his boxing title for refusal to join the U.S. Army and fight in the Vietnam War, joining millions of opposition to the United States imperialist war. April 1943 to February 1st, 1973. Ernestina Titina Sila, revolutionary female leader in the national liberation struggle of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, mother, nurse, militant. She was murdered by the Portuguese colonialist on her way to the funeral of her assassinated leader, Imelda Cabral, and founder of the PAIGC, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. April 29th. We recall that the Mayans, the first people in the Western world to keep historical records. Their written history begins in 50 BC when Spain and the rest of the European countries did not yet exist as nations nor cultural entities. April 29th, 1992. 4 LA police officers are acquitted of civil rights violations in the beating of Rodney King, setting in motion rebellions in 22 cities of the United States. In Los Angeles alone, Africans and Native Americans Latinos jointly rose against major symbols of corporate and civil United States in the first black-brown urban rebellion in the United States history. April 30th, 1975. Vietnam, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, after more than 40 years of armed struggle, defeating the French at Dien Bien Phu and subsequently defeating the United States, reunites Vietnam under a free and independent Vietnamese government. The two most powerful military capitalist countries in the world are both defeated by a peasant-based agricultural society, thereby verifying the adage, "The power of the people is greater than the white man's technology." April 30th, 1866. Siki Tuklani was a Mescalero Apache woman, warrior in Geronimo's guerrilla army, daughter of Chief Coco, fought alongside Geronimo in efforts to maintain the freedom of Native America from European settler colonialism. May 1st, May Day, International Workers' Day, a day where workers of the world unite and celebrate their historical struggle against exploitation by the capitalist ruling class. May 1st, 1970, the United States invades Cambodia. This has been Sister Luyanda for Freedom Now 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara. For comments or questions, email us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. And in the chant of our brothers and sisters in Azania, Amanda Awetu, Amanda Awetu, Amanda Awetu.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Keith Finley, Associate Professor of History at Southeastern Louisiana University, and author of the book From Slavery to Segregation, Reckoning with White Supremacy in the American South. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Keith Finley.
Thank you for having me, Gerald.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you produce this book?
Well, the reason why I produced this book was it was the continuation of a research project that had been going on for me for years. Before the book that we're talking about today was this book, which is Delaying the Dream, Southern Senators and the Fight Against Civil Rights. And in this book, I looked exclusively at Southern United States senators from the 1930s to the 1960s. And I looked at the manifold ways in which they tried to block or resist civil rights advances in America. And while working on that book, one of the things that struck me most was that the arguments that they made were very different from what I expected. I expected to see a lot of filibustering, time wasting, the typical things we associate with Southern filibusters, things like pot liquor recipes and reading from phone books and all that kind of stuff. But that's not what I saw. These folks had crafted a long array of constitutional arguments, social arguments, why they believed that segregation or different voting qualifications needed to remain in place. And as I was working on that, I was like, there's more to this story that I want to tell. And that kind of led to the production of the book From Slavery to Segregation, which we're talking about today, where I began with the arguments from the 20th century, and I'm like, where do these things come from? And did they exist in the age of the antebellum period? Did they exist in the Reconstruction era? And as I started going back in time, that's one of the things that really stood out to me was how common within the South's different racial systems, and that's the system of slavery, the system of Jim Crow segregation, that a lot of these arguments are exactly the same. So you're looking at 150, 200 years of history, and you have this long array of arguments that remain consistent across time. And I found that as particularly telling, that these weren't arguments that just came out of nowhere in defense of segregation. These were deeply rooted in the region's past, and in many ways in the nation's past. And I think that's an important part of this particular narrative. Although we talk about the American South, and I write about the American South, a lot of the ideas, a lot of the belief systems that we find in the American South were common throughout the country. And it's kind of often overlooked. I'm a New York Yankee myself, although I live in Louisiana now. And, as New York Yankees, we pat ourselves on the back like, we're the good guys in history. But then when you start looking at the history, we're not always the good guys, and that is an important lesson for everyone to remember. The culpability for events in the past, we're all kind of on the hook for that. And it's easy to just say, well, that's just the Southerners, but it's not. And that's kind of one of the things that's revealed in From Slavery to Segregation is throughout this story, there's that narrative that ties the North to the story too.
So there's a continuity, as you tell the story, from the pre-Civil War defense of slavery through the massive resistance in Dixie to desegregation. Could you elaborate on that, and in that context, share with us what precisely was the defense of slavery?
Okay. Well, one of the things that we see the continuity is, one of the things you can't avoid is the racial arguments that tie this all together. And I often, when I talk about this book and in some of to the local historical associations, one of the stories I reference all the time because it kind of reflects how long these ideas have been around. I talk about something called the Curse of Ham. And for the listeners out there, if you're familiar with the Bible, the book of Genesis, there is this story in which Noah's son sees his father naked, drunk on the ground, and the son jokes about it and brings his brothers in. Well, long story short, Noah places a curse on Ham's son and all of his descendants. And the argument is that all of Ham's sons, which would be people of African origin, all of his descendants are cursed by God to be inferior, to be enslaved, and all that. And the thing is, you see this very commonly in the antebellum South. But then you also see it as late as the 1960s, when groups like the Citizens Council are sending out their segregationist literature. Right there in the front is The Curse of Ham, and they're using that same story. And then you go back in British history, and you see that story in the 1700s, in the 1600s. So here's an idea that's been around for 400 years, and it's constantly being resurrected. You know, those are the kind of things when we talk about the continuity of thought here. You absolutely see that with the racial component to this. You know, that they were fishing about for explanations of why we as a Christian people are going to hold others in bondage, and how can we reconcile our faith with our actions on the ground. And using things like this Curse of Ham is one way in which a lot of white Southerners from the antebellum period all the way through to the end of Jim Crow, they use those ideas. But beyond the obvious racial ones, there's also a very clear argument that ties the institution of slavery, Jim Crow segregation, to the U.S. Constitution. You know, a lot of these white Southerners made the case that we were the true preservers of the Constitution as the founding generation intended. So all of our racial laws, whether it be slavery, whether it be segregation, were all sanctioned by the Constitution, were all approved essentially by the founding fathers. And if you're looking for an argument, you always go back to the founding fathers. Well, the founding fathers said this, so obviously we are correct. There's a lot of problems with that line of reasoning, and especially the way that Southerners kind of looked at an interpretation of the Constitution that was locked into 1787, 1788, and that never grew with time. You know, theirs was a vision that was extraordinarily stagnant. And you see that in all of the defenses of slavery, you see that in the defenses of segregation, that they're not advancing or in any way believing that the Constitution is a fluid or flexible document. It's extraordinarily rigid. The flaw, of course, and Gerald, as a historian, you know, and many in the audience probably already are kind of recognize, is we use terms like the founding fathers a lot, but a lot of, you know, what we forget is that they didn't agree with each other. And, people even to this day look back to the past, look back to the revolutionary generation and say, well, this is what the founders intended. But if you read what the founders themselves wrote, you get a very clear sense that they didn't always agree on everything either. So the very people who are portrayed as monolithic in the South's defense of its political systems, they weren't monolithic at all. I mean, they had an extraordinarily diverse array of opinions on a lot of issues, but especially on what type of government that they had created. And I think that kind of is overlooked, but it's an important part of how the Southern politicians, the Southern drivers of culture, how they perceive things. Did I miss one aspect of your question? I feel like I have.
Oh, no, not at all. But I do have another question, which is, you note in your pages the book by Edmund Morgan, American Slavery, American Freedom. What did he say in that text, and what do you make of it?
Well, I mean, when Edmund Morgan's book came out, you're looking at, it was right close to the bicentennial so we're celebrating another, it's America 250 right now, and that celebration's going on. Edmund Morgan's book came out in the mid-1970s, and America's celebrating 1776, the 200th anniversary. And, he writes this book, American Slavery, American Freedom, which is a history of colonial Virginia. But in that book, he makes the case that American notions of liberty, American notions of freedom and independence, all of that, were inherently linked to the existence of slavery in Virginia. And that's a powerful concept, and it's one that folks are often very uncomfortable to grapple with, but it's an essential part of America's history. And one of the things that Morgan makes very clear is that if you look at America's history, you look at places like Virginia where slavery was everywhere. The idea was that people who were from the slaveholding states really appreciated freedom, because all around them they saw people without freedom who were enslaved, people who did not have liberty. So the idea was the most zealous defenders of things like freedom and liberty would be white Southerners who lived amongst a large enslaved population, because they saw every day what not having freedom actually meant. So, and it's interesting, but of course, their narrative was not an inclusive narrative. And Edmund Morgan's account, and one of the things I write in my recent book, was, when Edmund Morgan wrote that book, people were kind of shocked. Like, whoa, this is revealing stuff. But all you got to do is look at the record. And, a lot of what the discussion I have about the antebellum period in this book is one of the things you see all the time was that these white Southerners who wrote these treatises defending the institution of slavery fully believed, and they openly say, look, we celebrate freedom, we celebrate liberty because we're free. And around us, there are people who are not. And that they believe this creates the perfect society. They make the case that you needed to have people who were at the bottom and would be the enslaved population. And since they're at the bottom, everyone else is exalted up the chain. So it's the idea that everyone, even of the most humble birth, if they are a white male, they have an exalted status within Southern society. And that was widely used throughout the antebellum period. And I focus primarily in from the 1830s on. Other historians have looked at, Southern arguments in defense of slavery in the period before this, the Revolutionary Age on forward. And I look at it roughly from the 1830s to the 1860s. And it's, that theme is everywhere evident. And it's an idea that continues on into the age of Jim Crow, where you have that same line of argument where white Southerners are exalted simply because of their skin color. And as a result of this, they are superior, and that creates a sense of equality amongst whites that's pure and true. Now, you could take that for what it's worth. But those ideas were widely popular. And it's one of the things that when I talk with my students in the classroom is to try to get them to understand, because today our students are like, well, these ideas are stupid. They're like, how do people believe this? And I was like, talk to your grandparents or talk to your great grandparents. For them, it was the world they grew up in. It's everywhere around them. It's in the books that they read, in the material they're taught in the classroom. It's written into the architecture of the South, having the white section, the black section. It was everywhere apparent. And, folks didn't question that as much as maybe our modern audience would. There's no social media or any of that kind of stuff. And, that's another thing that our students today grapple with. Well, why didn't they just look on YouTube? Well, YouTube didn't exist. But, today our students are much more attuned to injustice, I'd like to think. And I think that's an incredibly important shift in this region. I teach in the Deep South in South Louisiana here. And, our students are much more aware of injustice in the world. And I think it's a wonderful thing to compare that to just 20 years ago. When I first started teaching at Southeastern, it was, I think, 2004, 2005, something like that. And just over that short amount of time, how much our students' perspectives on matters of race, on matters of oppression, how those things have changed. And I think that's for the better. Now, of course, the older generation, that's a whole nother story. But our young people, they're much more aware, much more politically aware, and they want us to care. And, I was having a conversation with my class just at the end of last semester, and it was December, right before the Christmas break. And, one of the things my students were like is, people of your generation, talking about me, talking about the other members of the faculty, they're like, you people have given up. You've given up on the idea of America being a place where everyone's given equality and everyone respects each other's opinion and respects each other as human beings. You guys have given up, but we genuinely care about these things. And they're very disenchanted with the present state of politics. They're very disenchanted with the sense that, well, this is how things are, you can't fix it. And a lot of them want to fix it. And it was a beautiful thing to see that kind of change, especially in this region. So, that change is coming, very, very slow. I mean, one of the things I write about, I reference one of our Louisiana politicians in this book, and he makes the case that you could pass every civil rights law you want. And he was saying this right when the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right after it had passed. And he's like, you can pass every law you want, but at the end of the day, right? This is taught in the family. We tell our children not to interact with African Americans. We tell them not to marry them, all these kind of things. And he's like, we control the future. And that's, also a pretty interesting thing when you look at all the massive civil rights laws of the 1960s. Does that change prejudice in America? Of course not. And, all of your Southern politicians understood this. that a lot of this is stuff that's taught in the home, and those things, have to be rectified through other means.
Finally, Keith Finley, author of the book From Slavery to Segregation, Reckoning with White Supremacy in the American South. What role does resistance play as a through line from the period of slavery to the period of so-called massive resistance to desegregation?
I mean, and this is a fascinating part of the story as well, is that, the people who are penning these pro-slavery arguments, the arguments in defense of segregation, they obviously don't exist in a vacuum. And they're responding to what they see on the ground before them. They're responding to what you call resistance. One of the things you see is very much throughout is when talking about the enslaved community itself. There's this constant undertone of there are a few bad apples here who stir trouble and try to sow discontent on the plantations, but those are always the minority, and we always handle them. And that same kind of logic continues into the age of segregation. I think of Alan Ellender, one of our Louisiana politicians, and I always use this quote because he says 99.9% of the black population in the South likes segregation and wants it to continue. It's just that small percentage who want to change things. But now, where does he come up with the statistic 99.9%? Obviously, that's, that's segregationist logic in a nutshell, right? We're just going to pull this arbitrary number out and say, if there's any signs of resistance anywhere, it's not real. It's coming from outside of the South. If you just look at folks who live in the South, you exclude outsiders, everybody is happy with the way things are. Everybody understands where they are and where they belong, but that's just not true. And when you think about the antebellum period, you think about what a lot of white Southern politicians were very much attuned to was the impact of the abolitionist movement. This movement to get rid of the institution of slavery, not just to block it like the anti-slavery folks, but to genuinely get rid of the institution of slavery, and folks who view the institution of slavery as an immoral blight on America that you need to rip out of the country, root and branch. And to those folks who defended slavery, the arguments were always, look, these folks are socialists. These folks are trying to destroy the country. And we have a quote in here where this is, overtly stated that this is just the beginning. And he makes the case that, the abolitionist movement's just part of this story. And yes, it's focusing on the South now. But the implication was that this is a slippery slope, an idea we're all very, very familiar with, as our politicians use this all the time. But you see it widely used in the plantation South. And the argument was, today they want to get rid of slavery here in the American South. But this is just the beginning. This is an effort to change the American way of life, to destroy our institutions, to get rid of Christianity. And I'm like, wow, okay, a lot is read into these very kind of these threats to one institution. They're reading it into, hey, they're going to try to destroy America. And you see that all the time. You see that throughout, you look at the early 1900s, and you see a lot of the fight against lynching laws, the idea to create a federal anti-lynching law to combat, that atrocious crime that was a uniquely Southern thing. Well, I guess Western at one point, and then a uniquely Southern thing. And, that same group of politicians, like, look, this isn't a problem here. This is outsiders looking to create discontent. There's a relatively small number of lynchings was always the argument that they made. And they make the case that each year we're reducing the number of lynchings which take place. And the statistics bore that out. They would look at the 1890s, which was the peak of lynching in the American South. And they're talking in the 19-teens, 1920s, 1930s. And yes, the number of lynchings had decreased some. So their argument was, look, we're fixing these problems. There is no problem in the American South. So everywhere you see resistance, right? Everywhere you see this pushback, white Southerners always had a response to it. But I think what's important is, in the end, when you look at the 1950s and 1960s, and you really start to see the grassroots civil rights movement blossoming, the one that we're all kind of familiar with, and you really start to see these folks on very dangerous ground, and they know it too. One of the Louisiana politicians that I quote in this book, he makes the case right after Brown versus Board. He's like, the show was over. And he's like, there's nothing we can do to block segregation from collapsing in the South. Our schools are going to be integrated. All of our businesses are eventually going to be integrated. He knows it in the 1950s. But at no point does he tell his constituents, look, the show is over. Let's just try to make something out of this. The argument's always, let's just dig in our heels and block this from happening. And of course, as you look at the moral crusade that the civil rights cause is, that profoundly changed the dynamic because you see violence, which had always undergirded the institution of slavery. Violence always undergirded the Jim Crow system. It was a part of how those institutions remained in place. And when people from outside the South watch the television and the transformative power of the television, like today, for us it's social media, in that age to see on the television for the first time, peaceful protesters being assaulted by law enforcement, the crowd and all that kind of stuff, there's no way you can argue that away. That was one of the things that, you truly see changing a lot of people's minds in America when they finally see for the first time, the violence that had always undergirded Jim Crow. It's one thing to read a newspaper article, and you can skim through that article and violence here, violence there. That's one thing. But to see it firsthand before your eyes on television, to see those videos, there's no explanation for that. And I think that was one of the things that always kind of undermined the Southern politicians who were trying to defend the status quo. It's pretty hard to defend what most Americans were seeing on the television. And, a lot of these Southern politicians understood that the show was over. I referenced several times the Virginia politician, a guy by the name of Harry Byrd, the guy who's responsible for, in theory, creating the term massive resistance. So he's often credited with that. And it was Harry Byrd right before he had to go on the Senate floor to deliver a speech against the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And he stopped by a newspaper reporter, a guy from Newsweek. And Newsweek says, well, Senator Byrd, what you going to talk about? How are things? And Harry Byrd allegedly kind of looked him in the eyes and he's like, look, we can't continue to deny the black population their basic constitutional rights. And then he goes on to the floor of the Senate and proceeds to defend the way the South's voting rules were in place, to defend the registration system that was in place. Even though in his heart of hearts, he knows there's nothing, we are violating the Constitution. We are violating people's rights. I know that, but I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm going to go out and defend those institutions. So that's one of the things that you're met with is this incredible degree of tragedy when you look at the history of the South. And you look at these politicians who knew what they were doing was wrong. And I think that's a lot less the case when you look at the folks who defended slavery. They genuinely believed in what they were saying. Once you start looking at some of these later figures in defense of segregation, you're really left with the sense that these guys knew what they were doing was wrong, and they lacked the courage. They lacked, I'm going to get voted out of office if I say anything other than defending the call for massive resistance. But it's a great tragedy in Southern history, broadly defined, when you have political figures who know what's going on is wrong, and they just proceed to do so anyway, and just defend what's wrong with great anger and hostility, defending their way of life. So it's a sad part of the South story. But again, as I kind of alluded to already, when I talk to my classes today, just how different their perspective is on a lot of these matters. A lot of folks are down on the present generation, but I have a great degree of respect for our young people because they understand that there are vestiges of this past that are still with us, and they don't like it. So many of them are attuned to the need for change, and they want to see change, and they understand that injustice continues, and they're looking to us. They're looking to myself. They're looking to you. They're looking to the people in this audience. We have to care, and as I said, I think it's a beautiful thing, and it's a sign of change in this region, and that's always good.
Well, Keith Finley, author of the book From Slavery to Segregation, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Amanda Laury Kleintop, Assistant Professor of History at Elon University in North Carolina, and author of the book Counting the Cost of Freedom, The Fight Over Compensated Emancipation After the Civil War. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Amanda Laury Kleintop.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And we're excited to have you. So why did you produce this book?
Well, this book actually came out of my dissertation work at Northwestern University, where I worked with Kate Mazur. I was lucky to stumble upon a project pretty early in graduate school. I had initially thought that I wanted to work on the history of the slave trade during the Civil War, something that a colleague, Robert Colby, has recently written about. We were just in her office talking, and she was like, well, wait, if people are buying and selling enslaved people in 1865, what do they think is going to happen here? And we were like, do they think they're going to get compensated? So I started to look into that question, and the answer was, yeah, they did. Certainly, quite a few of them did. So I really started looking into early Dunning School histories and just seeing how they weren't or really treating that issue. And then at the same time, I found, pretty big evidence that it was an issue just when I looked at the fourth section of the 14th Amendment, for example, which nullifies any claim for compensation for slaves. I also went through state constitutional conventions for former Confederate states during Reconstruction that were also debating the issue pretty actively. And so that, with that evidence, I was armed with a project that is now a book.
Now, the enslaved were not compensated, obviously, and nor the enslavers, as you detail, except in the District of Columbia, the capital. Why there?
Yeah, why Washington, D.C.? So this is also something that other historians have written about. The enslavers in Washington, D.C. are compensated in part because of Congress's territorial power, right, over, Congress has a few different forms of power, right, in the Constitution over DC. And those are the mechanisms that Congress is using to abolish slavery there. And Republicans in Congress, right, actually have the ability to do so in part because those who would have opposed it are not in Congress anymore, right? The southern states have seceded, and now congressional Republicans can push forward those emancipation policies. They end up compensating enslavers because of these really long-standing debates over whether or not enslavers need to be compensated in the event of emancipation. And this is not just a national, but an international conversations that's been happening throughout the Atlantic world as slavery is abolished at different times and in different places. And the idea is that the nation granted enslavers property rights in people, right? The ability to own and profit from property in people. So this debate is, you have emancipation in Britain in the background of this. From the 1830s, the British Empire abolishes slavery by directly paying enslavers and also forcing formerly enslaved people to continue to work for free for their enslavers for a number of years. You have northern states that abolished slavery right after the American Revolution. And they notably do not pay enslavers, but they also do not actually free living enslaved people for the most part. They pass free womb laws that free the children. of enslaved people, but not the enslaved people themselves, so that they can't be accused of taking property from an enslaver without quote unquote just compensation, which is right in the Fifth Amendment's takings clause. So when it comes to abolishing slavery in Washington, D.C., Republicans in Congress are really also, like northern states, trying to avoid this issue a little bit. They know abolitionist congressmen really avoid calling payments in D.C. compensation to enslavers. Instead, they're going to call it a ransom, because they don't want to tacitly acknowledge that enslavers had a right to compensation. Others are also kind of arguing that, right, they still have to pay enslavers because in DC, because they are citizens of the US, their property rights have to be respected. And so that debate in DC actually kind of leaves the door open for continuing conversations in even the former Confederacy.
So which states were in the vanguard of demanding compensation for enslavers? Texas, Mississippi, South Carolina, Virginia. And let me attach an adjunct to that question, which is, I assume that these enslavers in Dixie were not very happy when they did not receive compensation. And could that have contributed to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, for example?
Yeah, so I mean, as you say, people are not happy, and this is one of the major arguments of the book, is that I think we've underestimated just how much enslavers did not accept immediate uncompensated emancipation as it happened after the Civil War, right? They did not take that as a given with Union victory. So the states that actually, one of the first states that is really actively claiming compensation, and I should say first former Confederate states that's claiming compensation from the federal government, is actually Louisiana. And during the war still, Unionists in Louisiana, so folks who largely opposed secession and still supported the Union in some way, shape, or form during the war, are going to say that they and enslavers who are also loyal to the Union deserve compensation as a reward, right, for their loyalty. And they're actually saying this as early as 1864, when Louisiana is coming back into the Union a little bit earlier than other former Confederate states, just because they are occupied earlier in the war. After they do not succeed, but they do petition Congress, and politicians in Louisiana will continue to petition Congress after 1864 as well for compensation. Their efforts, lead for Mississippi, where there's also a political party in Mississippi during Reconstruction that wants compensation. Texas is another state, and Texas, I think, is a good example too of where we see violence kind of coming into this. And I will also say Georgia. I would name Georgia for sure as another state where we see this happening. It is actually in Georgia's 1865 state constitution. In their article that abolishes slavery, it also says that Georgia will not, that just because they abolish slavery does not mean that Georgia will give up a future claim for compensation for slaves. To that question about the Klan and violence, yeah, I think we see those linkages happening here for sure. The attitude, right, that enslavers have a right to own and profit from people in emancipation does lead to violence. And I think this attitude, it's important to kind of understand it as this physical and legal attitude, right? So you see enslavers in remote areas literally holding on to enslaved people, like lying to them, telling them they can't leave, right? And some people know, right? And they are trying to leave and trying to get support from their communities, maybe the U.S. Army, which is harder to access in those remote areas, to try to leave. We also see kind of this entitlement among former enslavers too, right? Like they've had this right to own people for so long that why would they imagine that was just gone, or why would they want to give it up? And so I think we see in Texas how those things kind of combine together. Unionist politicians in Texas are actually warning President Andrew Johnson and their governor, Andrew Jackson Hamilton, that violent resistance is going to continue as long as former enslavers seek compensation, if not also, obviously, the continuation of slavery. In Texas, Hamilton does take up measures to stop the movement, and he delays the state's constitutional convention to re-enter the Union until 1866, which is months after other former Confederate states. And that delay successfully breaks up the opposition and those who would claim compensation. I would also add, too, that we see these links between violence and white violence and compensation and particularly economics throughout Reconstruction. The politicians are going to continue to emphasize this relationship. They're going to, particularly those sympathetic to white Southerners, are going to blame immediate uncompensated emancipation for the South's poverty during and after Reconstruction. And when Republicans start kind of going after the Klan nationally, they're actually going to start saying, hey, it's not emancipation that impoverished the South. It is continued Klan violence that is terrorizing Black communities and their economies. That's devastating the Southern economy, not the results of emancipation.
Now, turn the coin over. In the immediate aftermath of the end of the U.S. Civil War, circa April 1865, was there a companion debate about reparations to the enslaved, compensation to the enslaved for their free labor?
Yeah. It was actually one of the hardest parts of my project to find conversations among Black Americans in that immediate post-war period about compensating enslavers alongside reparations to the enslaved. However, throughout history, right, we do know that African Americans or enslaved people and their descendants seek what we today call reparations. So where I really started, or what I started to see in my research was a trend, especially throughout the 19th century, that most Americans are taking enslavers' claims for compensation more seriously because of those international precedents and legal protections that enslavers enjoyed before the Civil War. However, almost without deviation, before the Civil War, whenever someone brings up compensating enslavers to end slavery, a radical abolitionist is going to ask, well, why not the enslaved? But to little effect in former politics. I do see these comparisons starting to surface and resurface, particularly after the Civil War and in later Reconstruction. And I see a number of politicians linking compensation to former enslavers and reparation to the formerly enslaved in really complicated ways. The Ex-Slave Pension Association, which Mary Frances Berry has written about with Callie House, they in the 1890s will actually say things like, well, if Lincoln would have paid enslavers if he had lived, then why can't we pay the enslaved? And they say that to justify their reparations claims, right? I also find in the 1890s, local and state politicians who are Black and white trying to run for office by offering to compensate former enslavers alongside the formerly enslaved. And now I think the context is important. This is a time when the South was economically depressed and the Democratic Party held control over a lot of the South. So third parties or fusionist parties are seeking the votes of white and Black constituents for election. So they're making this comparison, which might seem counterintuitive to us today. But what they're kind of saying is slavery and the Civil War are fundamentally about profits, money, property, and labor as organized and sanctioned by law. So, if, as the Ex-Slave Pension Association said, if it's plausible to talk about compensation for enslavers, why isn't it plausible to talk about compensation for the enslaved? Now, I don't want to overstate the comparisons. The discourses aren't very tightly linked. And unfortunately, the comparisons often worked against reparations claims. The national press is really dismissive of both claims. They are kind of saying like, well, enslavers didn't receive compensation, so why would the enslaved? And Black and white newspapers are also repeatedly dismissing, condemning, and mocking any pursuit of joint compensation for both white and Black Southerners. On top of that, I also tell a story about how this attention to the material and profit-making aspects of slavery is also going to make Democrats and Confederate veterans a little bit uneasy, right, about what that would say about the causes of the Civil War and their motivations as well.
Speaking of which, what was Lost Cause history and what role does it play in your story?
Yeah, so a lot of historians, really great historians, have written about the Lost Cause. We've seen the Lost Cause in our own politics today in the form of, Confederate monument conversations and debates. The Lost Cause essentially is the idea that it's a few different ideas. It's a national narrative of the Civil War and Reconstruction history that depends on the ideas that, that white Southerners didn't fight a war for slavery, they fought a war for state sovereignty, among other things. And, monuments are just one example of how this history has gotten baked into national culture as well as the history books. So I add to this that not only is this conversation, this Lost Cause narrative dependent on the idea that the war was about state sovereignty, not slavery, but erasing this history of enslavers claiming compensation was essential to establish this Lost Cause narrative, because essentially Confederate veterans could turn around and say, well, slavery wasn't profitable. Enslavers never wanted compensation. They didn't ask for it and they didn't receive it. And that actually happened right around the same time, right, that folks like the Ex-Slave Pension Association are making comparisons between compensation and reparations to the enslaved. I didn't find a smoking gun linking them, I'll admit, but it is very notable that by the late 1890s, the historians, the kind of official historians of the United Confederate Veterans are saying that former enslavers never asked for compensation, and what's more, they didn't need it. They're saying slavery wasn't profitable, so how could the Civil War have been a war fought over slavery if it wasn't profitable anyway?
Finally, Amanda Laury Kleintop, author of the book Counting the Cost of Freedom, you've mentioned periodically international examples. For example, the compensation of enslavers in Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, etc. Are there other international examples that were cited by the enslavers in the United States? And to what extent did the enslavers in the United States receive support from former enslavers abroad?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I don't know that last part of the question. I don't know the answer to that about the extent of support from former enslavers abroad. I would be really excited for another historian to look at that, though. A lot of the scope of my book was just even establishing the argument, right, that enslavers did seek compensation after Confederate defeat, because that had been so dismissed by historians who kind of picked up that lost cause argument as well. What other precedents, though, that enslavers in the US were citing, the British example is one of the biggest examples, I think, for a lot of reasons. For one thing, the British example, a historian has written pretty extensively about this. There was little in British law and British precedent for them to actually pull from. Instead, the British had this narrative that abolishing slavery and paying enslavers was important as a kind of as a way to forgive the national sin of slavery. So the British were kind of saying, we are complicit in establishing slavery and in profiting from slavery, and the only way for us to acknowledge that is to pay back the enslavers, which is I think, again, somewhat twisty logic to many of us today. So I think that language was actually adopted by folks like Abraham Lincoln early in the war, to kind of say that we have a national duty, right, to end slavery. And in Lincoln's case, it was with or without compensation. The two enslavers, of course. I think we also I looked particularly for other examples from Latin American nations too, where Latin American countries had also, many of them also abolished slavery with free room laws or some form of compensation to enslavers. And they did that in their own kind of revolutionary wars, right, against the Spanish Empire to establish independence. And they also had a history of, like the U.S., right, of accepting African Americans, Black men into the army of those revolutionary fights. So I was looking to see if there was anything there too, but I think that Americans, enslavers in the U.S., were not really making that comparison as much, in part because they didn't see themselves, right, and they weren't part of a colonial struggle. So there goes that comparison. They also were making some more of those direct comparisons to northern states, though, which were also abolishing slavery in a revolutionary struggle. I think that those examples worked more because enslavers could pull direct correlations between the legal systems, right? Even though those were very inconclusive. Notably, no one brought up Haiti, which is also something I was looking for. I think even historians kind of compare, sometimes historians will say that Haiti and the U.S. South are the only two places where emancipation happened without compensating enslavers. But Haiti is also a really complicated case if we consider the French indemnity, as so many more historians and I think journalists have brought our attention to in the past 10 years or so. Arguably there was compensation to enslavers, certainly to France and Haiti. And again, I think that the fact that enslavers in the U.S. weren't making any kind of comparison like that, well, it says a lot more about how they're imagining the U.S. relationship with Haiti. But I think it's also showing the difference in those kind of colonial struggles as compared to, arguably a treasonous attempt to separate themselves from the Union. So they can't. It would have been more difficult, right, for them to portray themselves as the victims, although they tried in other ways.
Treasonous attempt indeed. Amanda Laury Kleintop, author of the book Counting the Cost of Freedom. But I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thanks for having me.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Amanda Laury Kleintop. Thank you, Keith Finley. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Brother Brandon, Sister Flora, and all those who made today's program possible. Stay tuned for The Signal coming up next with our brother Dino. And thank you to our board op Sly and all those who made today's program possible. Signing off, this is Sister Thage. And until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.